Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling and unexplained cases ever documented in the American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. On the frozen morning of January 1855, the residents of Callaway County, Missouri, awoke to the acrid smell of charred wood and something far worse drifting across their farmlands, and what they discovered in the smoldering ruins of the Newsom barn would become one of the most horrifying and deliberately buried cases in American legal history. Inside those blackened timbers lay the calcified remains of Robert Newsom, a respected landowner whose body had been burned so completely that only his gold pocket watch and wedding ring remained identifiable. But this wasn't an accident nor random violence. It was the culmination of 5 years of systematic brutalization that pushed a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Celia to commit an act so shocking that Missouri's courts would spend months deciding whether she even had the legal right to defend herself. What happened in that barn wasn't just murder. It was a reckoning that exposed the darkest contradictions at the heart of American society, a story so disturbing that local authorities buried every record they could find. Before continuing with the story of Celia and the night that changed everything, the narrator urges listeners to subscribe and comment their state, reminding them that these truths about American history demand to be heard nationwide. The events that unfolded were documented in court records, newspapers, and testimonies preserved in the Missouri State Archives, though many believe key documents mysteriously vanished over the decades. In 1850, Callaway County was a prosperous farming region along the Missouri River, its tobacco and hemp plantations defining a landscape known as Little Dixie, where nearly 40% of the population lived in bondage under families who had migrated from Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Robert Newsom, a 60-year-old widower living 6 miles south of Fulton, owned a modest but well-run farm with a 2-story white house, several outbuildings, and 5 enslaved people who performed most of the labor. Known for his rigid sense of control, his neighbors described the farm as operating with military precision, and though he attended Methodist services alone and appeared generous to the community, those on his property felt a far different side of him. In June 1850, he paid $800 in gold for Celia, a 14-year-old enslaved girl described in the bill of sale as being of good health and breeding potential, a term that carried horrific implications in the slave markets of the antebellum South. Though only 50 miles separated her previous home from Newsom's land, the move marked her entry into 5 years of escalating abuse. Witnesses described Celia as tall, intelligent, and unusually literate for someone in her position, able to read simple words and perform basic arithmetic despite such skills being illegal for enslaved people in Missouri. The Newsom farm itself, with its isolated layout and log slave cabin lacking windows, was a place where screams would not carry far, and from the moment Celia arrived, the tension among the other enslaved workers, Ben, Coffee, Patty, and young Joe, signaled that something darker operated beneath the farm's well-kept appearance. Later testimonies revealed that Newsom had warned the others to stay out of his business with the new girl, a threat that hinted at the horrors Celia would endure and foreshadowed her role in a legal case that would force Missouri's courts to grapple with questions they had spent decades avoiding. Could an enslaved woman legally defend herself against rape? Could property resist its owner? And what happened when the law's protection of white male authority collided with its pretense of Christian morality? The assault began on Celia's first night at the Newsom farm and continued with methodical regularity for the next 5 years, and what we know of those early months comes from Celia's own devastating testimony, words so disturbing that the court reporter's handwriting visibly trembled as he wrote them. She recounted that before she even unpacked her few belongings, Robert Newsom made his intentions clear, telling her she was to come to the house when called, that she'd been bought for more than field work, and that she would soon learn exactly what that meant. By day, he maintained the facade of a respectable Christian farmer, but at night, once his daughters slept and other enslaved workers were warned to stay in their quarters, he summoned Celia to the main house. The physical evidence mounted as she gave birth to her first child at 16 in 1852, a boy with Newsom's unmistakable pale green eyes, and though his daughters claimed ignorance, neighbors testified they must have known. More grotesque were the tactics Newsom used to control her, keeping a leather-bound ledger noting every behavior of every enslaved person, real or imagined, a psychological weapon that allowed him to threaten anyone who showed Celia sympathy. Ben later testified that Newsom warned him that anything happening after dark was nobody's business but his and that anyone interfering would be sold downriver, a threat that, in Missouri, meant near certain death on the brutal plantations of Louisiana or Mississippi. The isolation of the farm enabled these crimes, with neighbors too far to hear anything and the property deliberately arranged to shield Newsom's actions from view. By 1853, Celia had given birth to a second child, again bearing her master's features, and Reverend John Hammond later noted the unsettling satisfaction Newsom showed during this period, content with his domestic arrangements and never seeking a new wife despite being a relatively young widower. The legal framework made Celia's horror complete. Enslaved people had no legal standing to accuse a white man of rape because, under Missouri law, property could not withdraw consent from its owner, a doctrine Newsom exploited without shame. He even escorted Celia into town and bought her finer dresses and small luxuries, displaying her like prized property while further distorting his sense of benevolence. The psychological toll on Celia grew, and though Coffey and others noticed her fear, they were powerless. By late 1854, witnesses saw a shift as Celia asked bolder questions about legal rights and self-defense, and Coffey recalled her asking whether a person could be held responsible for protecting themselves if the law refused to protect them. Pregnant with her third child, Celia reached a breaking point. The winter of 1854 was brutally cold, isolating farms for weeks, and during this period Celia began asking Ben questions about fire, burn rates, collapsing structures, and bone destruction, questions he assumed related to her household duties. Meanwhile, Coffey noticed she was collecting rope, metal tools, hay, and pine pitch. Celia claimed she was preparing for emergencies during the storms, and given the weather, no one questioned her further. Trial evidence would later show she'd spent months developing a desperate, methodical plan. Court documents suggest she accessed legal texts, perhaps from Newsom's own library, and realized she would never receive legal protection. She would have to take justice into her own hands. The final catalyst came when Newsom announced his daughters would spend New Year's week in Jefferson City, leaving him alone on the farm, an ominous sign for Celia, who knew his abuse intensified when they were away. On December 30, 1854, Celia made her first direct act of resistance. She confronted Newsom in the kitchen and asked him to stop his nightly assaults, citing her pregnancy and failing health, a bold break from the farm's established power dynamics. Newsom's response was swift and brutal. Coffey later testified that she heard raised voices followed by the sound of a physical altercation, and when she entered the kitchen she found Celia on the floor with a bleeding lip while Robert Newsom stood over her, his face flushed with rage as he warned, "You don't make demands in my house. You'll do as you're told or you'll learn what real punishment looks like." That night, as temperatures plunged toward zero, Newsom made good on his threat. According to Celia's later testimony, he summoned her to his bedroom with unprecedented violence, making it clear that her pregnancy would not protect her, and the assault that followed was the most brutal she had endured in 5 years. But Celia, transformed by months of planning, had reached a breaking point and made a decision that would alter her life and ignite one of Missouri's most controversial legal cases. On the evening of December 31, 1854, as Newsom prepared for another night of domination, Celia was making final preparations for her act of resistance, aided by the bitter New Year's cold that isolated the farm beneath frost-covered windows. During the day, Newsom followed his routine, increasingly agitated and drinking more than usual, while Coffee noticed him glancing at the snowy road in case his daughters returned early, though travel was impossible. As evening fell, his attention fixed on Celia, who maintained an eerie calm while subtly preparing the house and barn, repositioning firewood, adjusting lamps, and making repeated trips to the barn under the guise of tending livestock. Around 8 p.m., Newsom dismissed the enslaved people to their quarters, where they huddled by their fire and braced for the familiar horrors that typically unfolded in the main house. But the sounds that night were different. Long stretches of silence interrupted by the shifting of furniture and the crash of crockery, until around 10 p.m. Coffee heard Newsom's voice in a tone of surprise she had never heard before, followed by an hour of chilling quiet. Celia's later courtroom testimony revealed what happened. Summoned as usual, she had come not to submit but to resist, telling Newsom she could not endure more, begging for mercy for the sake of her unborn child, and asking him to wait until after the birth. Instead, he struck her to the floor. But when she rose and warned she would defend herself if he touched her again, Newsom responded with a violence even greater than before, grabbing her throat and threatening to kill her and blame pregnancy complications. Celia, anticipating this, seized the heavy iron poker she had hidden near the fireplace and struck him across the temple, knocking him unconscious. When he fell, she waited to see if he would rise, but when it became clear that he was dead, skull fractured, eyes staring, she faced the terrible reality that she had killed a white man in Missouri, a crime punishable by certain execution regardless of the circumstances. Knowing the law offered no protection to an enslaved woman who killed her master, she acted with desperate intelligence, executing the plan she had crafted over weeks. Despite being 6 months pregnant and injured, she dragged Newsom's body downstairs using sheets and rope she had prepared, hauling him to the barn where she had previously arranged hay, firewood, pine pitch, dried corn stalks, and even the fine fabrics he had bought her, materials chosen for their ability to burn hot enough to destroy evidence. Coffee, watching from the quarters, saw flickering lights in the barn after midnight and later smelled the unmistakable, sickening scent of burning flesh drifting through the farm around 2 a.m. The fire, engineered with precision, burned intensely but in a controlled manner that left the barn structure intact enough to suggest an accidental blaze. By dawn on January 1, 1855, the fire had died out, leaving behind a scene that might have been mistaken for an unfortunate accident. Celia calmly prepared breakfast as the other enslaved people emerged, claiming that Newsom had left early for business in town despite the holiday and brutal cold. But suspicion quickly grew when neighbor Thomas Shulman arrived for a planned meeting and found only Celia at the house. Noticing the burned barn, the stalled horse, and Newsom's winter coat still hanging by the door, he questioned the enslaved people until Ben admitted he had not seen the master leave. Searching the barn ruins, Shulman and others found fragments of bone, teeth, and Newsom's cracked gold pocket watch. With the evidence exposed, Celia's story collapsed, and as neighbors confronted her, she became something far more threatening to Missouri's slaveholding order, a woman willing to speak the truth about what slavery truly meant. The moment of reckoning came around 4 p.m. on January 2, 1855, as long shadows stretched across the ash-covered barn floor. Thomas Shulman held up the charred remains of Robert Newsom's pocket watch, its gold case blackened, but still bearing the engraved inscription RN, faithful service to God and country. The other men, farmers, businessmen, pillars of Callaway County society, stood in a silent circle around the evidence of murder and destruction. Celia, who had been brought to the barn under guard, showed none of the hysteria or collapse that the men expected from a woman caught in such circumstances. Instead, according to multiple witness accounts, She displayed what one observer described as an unsettling calm, as if she had prepared for this moment for years. When confronted directly with the evidence of her crime, Celia made a choice that stunned everyone present. Rather than denying her involvement or pleading for mercy, she looked each man in the eye and spoke words that would echo through Missouri's legal system for months to come. "Yes, I killed Robert Num," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I killed him because he had been raping me for 5 years since I was 14 years old. I killed him because he told me he would continue to rape me until the day I died and that my children would suffer the same fate. I killed him because the law gave me no other choice." The silence that followed this confession was profound. Here was an enslaved woman not only admitting to killing her master, but doing so in language that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Missouri society. By using the word rape to describe her master's actions, Celia was asserting that an enslaved person could withdraw consent, a legal concept that Missouri law specifically rejected. Thomas Schultzman, who would later testify at her trial, reported that his first instinct was to strike Celia for her insolence. But something in her demeanor stopped him. This wasn't the behavior of a woman begging for forgiveness or claiming temporary insanity. This was someone who had made a calculated decision and was prepared to face the consequences. "She looked at us like we were the criminals." Showman testified like she was the judge and we were the ones on trial. The detailed account that Celia provided of Robert Newsom's crimes was devastating in its specificity. She described not only the systematic sexual abuse that had produced 2 children, but also the psychological torture that Newsom had used to ensure her compliance. She spoke of threats against the other enslaved people, of punishment that would extend to anyone who tried to help her, of a system designed to make resistance impossible. What made her testimony even more disturbing was the clinical precision with which she described the murder itself. She explained how she had studied Newsom's routines for months, learning when he was most vulnerable and how to position herself for maximum advantage. She detailed the construction of the funeral pea, the temperature required to completely consume human remains, and the careful arrangement of evidence to suggest an accidental fire. "I spent every night for 4 months planning how to kill him," she told the horrified men. "I studied his books to learn about law, about fire, about what it would take to make him disappear completely. I wanted him to burn the way he made me burn inside." More damaging still, she provided details about Newsom's behavior that only someone with intimate knowledge could have known: the location of scars on his body, his habits and mannerisms, conversations that had taken place behind closed doors. She described how he would force her to address him as master even during the most intimate violations, how he would quote scripture while assaulting her, and how he had begun planning to abuse her infant daughter once the child was old enough. But the most shocking aspect of Celia's confession wasn't what she revealed about Robert Newsom's crimes. It was her articulation of the legal philosophy that had driven her to murder. During her months of secret study, she had somehow gained an understanding of legal principles that challenged Missouri's slave codes at their foundation. "If I am property," she told her captives, "then I cannot be held responsible for crimes against my owner because property cannot commit crimes. But if I can be held responsible for murder, then I must be a person with the right to defend myself. You cannot have it both ways." This logic was so dangerous to the established order that several of the men present reportedly urged immediate lynching rather than allowing Celia to repeat these arguments in a courtroom. The idea that an enslaved person could use legal reasoning to challenge the system that enslaved them was more threatening than simple violence. It suggested that the entire structure of Missouri society might be built on contradictions that could not withstand scrutiny. The moment that truly broke the composure of her captives came when Celia began to describe the network of people who had helped her. She spoke of free blacks in Jefferson City who had smuggled her legal documents, of a sympathetic clerk in the courthouse who had allowed her access to law books, and most shockingly of several prominent white citizens who had known about Num's crimes and chosen to remain silent. Judge Marshall knew, she said, naming a respected local magistrate. He saw the bruises on my arms when I accompanied my master to town. Reverend Hammond knew. He saw my children and couldn't help but notice who they resembled. Dr. Breenidge knew when he treated my broken ribs last spring. They all knew, and they all decided that Robert Newsom's reputation mattered more than my suffering. The decision to pursue a legal trial rather than extrajudicial execution was ultimately made by Judge William Hall, who had been summoned to the scene as word of the crime spread throughout the county. Hall, a Virginian jurist with deep roots in Missouri's slaveholding community, recognized that Celia's case posed questions that the legal system would eventually have to confront. Better to address them in a controlled courtroom setting than to allow them to fester in the community's collective conscience. But even as preparations began for what would become one of the most controversial trials in Missouri history, another layer of the mystery began to unfold. During the search of the Newsom property, investigators discovered evidence that Celia's education and legal knowledge hadn't emerged from nowhere. Hidden in the slave quarters, they found books, newspapers, and legal documents that no enslaved person should have possessed. Materials that suggested a network of support that extended far beyond the isolated farm. More disturbing still was the discovery of detailed journals in Celia's handwriting, documenting not only her own abuse, but that of other enslaved women throughout Callaway County. The journals contained names, dates, and specific incidents that painted a picture of systematic sexual violence that extended far beyond the Newsom farm. Several prominent families were implicated, creating the possibility that Celia's case might expose a web of crimes that the community's leadership had worked for decades to conceal. The question of how an enslaved woman in rural Missouri had gained access to legal texts, learned to read complex arguments, and developed the intellectual framework for her resistance opened new avenues of investigation that would prove almost as controversial as the murder itself. Who had been helping Celia? How extensive was this network of support? And what other enslaved people in Missouri might be receiving similar education and inspiration? As Celia was transported to the Callaway County Jail to await trial, these questions hung over the community like smoke from the burned barn. The physical crime had been solved, but the intellectual and moral challenges it represented were just beginning to unfold. The trial of Celia began on October 9, 1855 in a Callaway County courthouse packed with spectators who had traveled from across Missouri to witness what newspapers described as the most significant legal proceeding in our state's history. The case had already generated intense controversy throughout the region, with abolitionist newspapers in the North hailing Celia as a symbol of resistance, while pro-slavery publications in the South denounced the proceedings as a dangerous precedent that threatened the entire institution. Judge William Hall, presiding over the case, faced legal questions that had never been directly addressed by Missouri courts. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their master? Did the state's laws protecting women from sexual assault apply to enslaved women? And perhaps most fundamentally, could property be held criminally responsible for crimes against its owner? Celia's defense team, led by John Jameson, a respected attorney who had taken the case pro bono despite significant social pressure, built their arguments around Missouri's existing statutes protecting women from sexual assault. They argued that these laws made no explicit racial distinctions and therefore should apply to all women within the state's borders. If Celia had the legal right to resist rape, then her killing of Robert Newsom constituted justifiable homicide. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Puett, countered with the fundamental principle of Missouri's slave code. Enslaved people were property, not persons under the law. As property, Celia could not withdraw consent from her master's actions, making the concept of rape legally impossible. Furthermore, They argued allowing enslaved people to claim self-defense against their masters would effectively end the institution of slavery by making masters vulnerable to violence whenever their authority was challenged. The testimony that emerged during the trial painted a devastating picture of life under slavery that many white Missourians had never directly confronted. Coffee, Ben, and other witnesses provided detailed accounts of the systematic abuse that Celia had endured, describing a level of sexual violence that shocked even hardened observers. More importantly, they revealed the network of support that had enabled Celia's resistance, a loose alliance of enslaved people, free blacks, and sympathetic whites who had provided her with books, legal knowledge, and emotional support. This network proved to be more extensive than anyone had imagined. Testimony revealed that Celia had been in contact with members of the Underground Railroad, though she had never attempted to escape. Instead, she had used these connections to gain access to legal documents and to develop her understanding of Missouri law. Her decision to resist through violence rather than flight was, her attorneys argued, a direct result of her legal education. She understood that even if she reached free territory, her children would remain enslaved and vulnerable to the same abuse she had suffered. The most damaging testimony for the prosecution came from Dr. Marcus Breenage, the physician who had treated Celia's injuries over the years. Despite intense pressure to remain silent, Breenage admitted under oath that he had documented clear evidence of sexual assault and physical abuse during multiple examinations. His medical records presented as evidence included detailed descriptions of injuries consistent with rape and violent assault, some dating back to when Celia was only 15 years old. "I knew what I was seeing," Dr. Breenage testified, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "But I also knew that speaking out would accomplish nothing except destroying my practice and endangering my family." The law provided no mechanism for protecting an enslaved woman from her master's abuse. Even more shocking was the testimony of Margaret Foster, a free black woman who had worked as a seamstress in Fulton and had maintained contact with Celia throughout her ordeal. Foster revealed that she had been documenting cases of sexual abuse against enslaved women for nearly a decade, creating a detailed record that implicated dozens of prominent families throughout central Missouri. Celia wasn't unique, Foster testified. She was just the first one brave enough to fight back. "Every enslaved woman I knew lived with this terror. Every one of them knew that their bodies belonged to their masters in ways that went far beyond labor." Foster's testimony opened the door to revelations that sent shock waves through Missouri society. The defense presented evidence that Robert Nunn had been part of an informal network of slaveholders who regularly shared and exchanged enslaved women for sexual purposes. Letters found in Newsom's personal effects described arrangements with neighboring farmers to borrow enslaved women for extended periods, often while their own wives were away visiting relatives. The prosecution's case began to unravel when they attempted to argue that Celia's actions were motivated by jealousy rather than self-defense. This line of reasoning backfired spectacularly when it became clear that it implicitly acknowledged a sexual relationship between Newsom and Celia, something that undermined their core argument that enslaved people could not be victims of sexual crimes. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that the case had transcended its original boundaries. Newspaper correspondents from as far away as New York and Charleston packed the courthouse, sending daily dispatches that turned Celia's story into a national sensation. Prominent abolitionists began organizing rallies demanding her freedom, while pro-slavery politicians denounced the proceedings as an attack on Southern institutions. The jury's deliberation lasted for 3 days, an unusually long time that reflected the complexity of the legal and moral questions they faced. When they finally returned to the courtroom on October 19, 1855, the tension was palpable. Every person in the packed courthouse understood that their verdict would have implications far beyond Celia's individual fate. The foreman, Thomas Westbrook, a farmer and Methodist lay preacher, stood to deliver the verdict with visible emotion. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree," he announced, his voice breaking. "But we recommend mercy based on the extraordinary circumstances of this case." The guilty verdict was legally inevitable under Missouri law, but the jury's recommendation for mercy was unprecedented. In their written statement submitted after the trial, the jurors acknowledged that they had been forced to convict Celia despite believing that her actions were morally justified. They called upon the governor to commute her sentence and urged the Missouri legislature to address the legal contradictions that had made their verdict necessary. Judge Hall, when pronouncing sentence, delivered what many historians consider one of the most remarkable judicial statements in American legal history. While bound by law to sentence Celia to death, he used his platform to condemn the system that had created the circumstances leading to Num's murder. This court has been compelled to apply laws that reduce human beings to property while simultaneously holding them accountable as persons when they resist their dehumanization. Hall stated, "This contradiction lies at the heart of our legal system and will, I predict, ultimately destroy the institution of slavery itself. Celia killed her master, and under our laws, she must die for that crime. But history will judge that the greater crime was the system that gave her no other choice." Celia's execution was scheduled for December 21, 1855, but she never lived to face the gallows. On November 23, aided by unknown accomplices, she escaped from the Callaway County jail. Despite extensive searches and a substantial reward offered for her recapture, she was never found. Rumors persisted for decades that she had been spirited north by Underground Railroad operatives, while others claimed she had died attempting to cross the Missouri River in winter conditions. The truth of Celia's fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of American history. What is certain is that her case fundamentally changed the legal landscape of Missouri and contributed to the growing national debate over slavery. The trial transcripts were widely distributed by abolitionist organizations, and Celia's story became a powerful symbol of resistance that inspired other enslaved people throughout the South. The long-term consequences of the case extended far beyond Celia herself. Several of the prominent families implicated in Foster's testimony faced social ostracism and economic boycott that forced them to leave Callaway County. Dr. Breenage's medical practice collapsed after his testimony, though he later became an active abolitionist and helped establish medical schools that would train physicians to treat former enslaved people during Reconstruction. Perhaps most importantly, the legal arguments developed during Celia's defense would later influence the broader constitutional debates that led to the Civil War. The contradiction that Judge Hall identified between treating enslaved people as property while holding them criminally responsible as persons became a central theme in abolitionist literature and legal challenges to slavery throughout the 1850s. The Newsom farm itself was abandoned shortly after the trial as no one was willing to purchase property associated with such notoriety. The burned barn was never rebuilt, and local residents reported that the site remained haunted by the memory of what had transpired there. By 1860, the entire property had returned to wilderness, with only the stone foundation of the main house, marking the location where one woman's desperate resistance had challenged the foundations of American society. This mystery shows us that even within the most oppressive systems, human dignity finds ways to assert itself, often at terrible cost. Celia's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history while recognizing the extraordinary courage of those who resisted injustice when the law offered no protection. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Celia's actions were justified given the circumstances she faced? Leave your comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you found this tale compelling and want to explore more hidden stories from American history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex realities of our past. These stories need to be told, and together we can ensure they're never forgotten. I'll see you in the next video where we'll uncover another chapter of history that they tried to bury.